This is a joint hearing or committee with Senate Finance and Senate Appropriations, and we have Chris Doss, who's here from the RAND Corporation, who has made himself available to answer questions regarding the financing study that has just been presented to the various committees, floor committees, in the last hour or so. So this is the opportunity to ask any clarifying questions or general questions that anyone might have regarding the work that we have here and the estimates, the methodology, and so. Oh, Keisha, you're welcome to please come in.
Okay, should I get the rest of my?
No, they don't want to, but we'd love to have you.
I feel a good chair.
Oh, good. That's my chair.
Yeah, run over if they have questions.
Okay.
You go first.
No, I was just waiting for.
Here I am.
All right, so Senator Baruch, you have the first question.
So I was wondering, and first of all, thank you so much. I think it's a very comprehensive looking report and gets at the real meat of what we needed. I was thinking about the compensation for the providers. And so the report is looking at, comparative levels of compensation in kindergarten teachers or something like that. What is the thinking about what happens, were we to set a level of compensation and then fund that level of compensation? What was the thinking about wage stagnation, let's say? So kindergarten teachers or first grade teachers here are almost all unionized. And so they're going to have step and raises on a yearly basis. So you're going to have this, immediate disparity unless there's some means of projecting a graduation on the provider side. So I didn't see that in the report. I saw it sort of moving to one place.
Yeah, that's a great question. I also want to note that my colleagues, Carol Lee and Aaron Strong, they're joining us via Zoom, and so I will also pass it to them to have a chance to answer. But
thank you as well to both of you for making yourself available.
No, I mean, it's a great question. And so the report, really tried to talk about the beginning of what an ECE system would look like, right? So we have a situation now where ECE providers are compensated at a very low level. And like Act 45 said, how do we get that to be more on par? So there are differences between the ECE sector and the K-12 sector, like you said, primarily unionization. And so what we're trying to do is try to get that at the starting level. And then as time goes on, it would be incumbent upon Vermont to figure out how do we incentivize people to continue that pay growth, to make sure that they are continue to be compensated at that comparable level, like you said, to avoid that wage stagnation. So the goal of the study was how do we get to the beginning point, and then what are the effects 5 years on? That was kind of the spirit of Act 45, and that's the spirit that we undertook. It didn't touch on that. How do you continue that beyond that? Because that wasn't quite in the scope of the act.
And not to interrupt you, but your projections then and the follow-on effects for 5 years, does it treat that compensation level as static for the 5 years?
It does, but Aaron, I'll let you to do that. But yeah, but we bring it up and then we say in the next 5 years, given this kind of bundle of a compensation, how does it all work?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is Aaron Strong. The one way to think about this is we're projecting it out in real terms, if that means anything, rather than nominal terms. And so, yes, over time, those increases in wages will be incorporated because the wage payments are in real terms. So it should increase with inflation.
Okay, if you could say the same thing but not use real and nominal, what do those mean?
So in what we've done is we've done all of our estimates using 2019 data, projected them out to 2022 using the Northeast inflation numbers. And then from there, as we move forward, we're doing everything in 2022 dollars. In reality, those dollars because of inflation would become more money.
Uh-huh.
So if you were compensated, let's just random, if you were compensated $50,000 in 2022, next year, assuming a 3% increase in inflation, you would be compensated 51,500. So it's taking it into account. It's just sort of in the background.
Okay, I get that. Thank you.
So I do have a question. Whenever you say cost-based reimbursement, that means different things to different people. And there can be great variability in cost. We know that. Look at higher education and tuition. And so in healthcare, that is a common term, cost-based, but it gets into how you set that standard for what is recognizable cost for, in healthcare, it's an efficiently and effectively operated program. Would this envision a rate setting mechanism that would recognize that increase in cost in this system as well? Now, we don't have that in our public system, K through 12. It's whatever the local budget is, and then and unlike the state budget, if the revenues are not performing at whatever that rate of cost, increase in cost, then the bottom default is an increase in property taxes, so that there's not an upper limit. It's whatever you vote, then the property taxes will be the way in which you get those necessary revenues. This would be within the state budgetary context. So I'm just wondering in terms of that cost, and that's our own language. I realize that. That's in the statute.
Yeah.
How we would address that whole cost dimension.
Yeah, I'll start and then I'll throw it in. But so when we talk about cost basis, what we're talking about, I kind of see it as like an ingredients, right? So we want to look at all those ingredients, all those components. So we've kind of laid out some hallmarks of high quality ECE, the student teacher ratios, the fact that you're using evidence-based curriculum, the fact that you have professional development, right? So each of those have a cost that's based on the research of what that would need to look like for a high quality ECE system. So when we talk about cost basis, we're talking about adding up all those ingredients to get that total cost. So it's a little bit different, again, like you said, versus healthcare versus the other sectors. We kind of look at it as like the ingredients part of it. And then, of course, now how that's operationalized by different providers will be different in different ways, and there can be different difference in the efficiencies and how they operationalize it. But when we're talking about the appropriations for the money, we're talking about what are those ingredients based on research that are needed in order to make that high quality ECE system. And then, Lynn, did you want to add on to that?
Yes, for the record, this is Lynn Carrolley from RAND. And again, thank you for having us here and for making it possible for me and Erin to join remotely. So to add to this point about reimbursement at cost or cost-based reimbursement, in the current early care and education sector, for providers who are providing subsidized care, you do have reimbursement rates under CCFAP, the Child Care Family Assistance Program. And those are set typically following federal government rules based on periodic surveys of prices of what providers charge. It's usually referred to as a regional market rate survey. And based on that distribution of prices, states make decisions how far up that distribution of prices they're going to reimburse providers for, which is a way of thinking about either how far up the quality curve we might be going, how far up, along that distribution of prices. One of the issues now is that providers don't always charge prices based on their true costs. And this is one of the issues in the marketplace for childcare, one of what economists might call market failure, because they're in part anticipating what parents can afford. So one thing we see, for example, and this is referenced in the report, is that providers tend to charge a similar amount whether they're serving an infant full-time, a toddler full-time, or a preschooler full-time, even though their actual costs for that full-time care are very different, because the infants require a ratio of 1 adult to 4 children as opposed to the 4-year-olds where it's a ratio of 1 to 10. So that's the current structure, largely setting reimbursement rates based on the prices that providers charge, and with a cap or a limit as to how far up that price distribution you go. So what states have started doing is recognizing that there are some flaws in that system. One of the challenges for providers is it makes it very difficult to increase the quality of care, to go beyond what the expected quality levels are, say, for licensing. One thing states have done is built in tiered reimbursement systems. So with a quality rating system, if you have a 5-star provider, states will reimburse them at a higher level for serving a child of any given age, recognizing that they're investing more in quality costs more. And so that gives the provider an incentive if they're reimbursed closer to what their costs are. So now we have the issue that as you're trying to invest more in quality, to have providers provide high quality, what are the strategies for reimbursing them that will reflect those differences? So one thing states are doing is increasing, either across the board or again associated with quality rating systems, the reimbursement rates, not so much guided by prices, but taking into account the actual cost of care. And in fact, with the reauthorization of the Child Care Development Block Grant, that was a requirement that states start to account for cost of care in setting those reimbursement rates, no longer relying exclusively on price. Another strategy that states are using, and this is one that states build into their underlying procurement systems, is to contract with individual providers to set a rate at which they will be reimbursed based upon their underlying cost structure. And having those contracts is one way, for example, of enforcing a salary scale. So you can say in your contract, we expect that you're going to be paying your classroom staff according to this schedule. You can define what costs are allowable and what's not allowable. You can account for the fact that some providers have to pay the full cost of the space that they use. Others might be getting subsidized space. Some own their own buildings and don't have a monthly mortgage. Others don't, they're paying a monthly rent. And so things like that vary by provider for a variety of reasons, you can now account for and individualize the reimbursement to match what that provider's cost structure looks like. Now, obviously, that's more involved in terms of setting up those contracts, having the contract mechanisms in terms of accountability and so on and so forth. But that's been a way for states, and in some cases, an example would be New York City has done this in their expanded system, to recognize these aspects of quality, but also other factors that affect the costs that providers face that if you are just setting these reimbursement levels, don't necessarily account for. I know that was a long answer, but hopefully we're getting into some of the weeds here, but I think that's important to understand some of those options.
No? Is that serious?
Yeah, I'm looking at the tax idea, and it's always been my theory that the more taxes you use, the more people you upset. So if we decided to go with an income tax, we would upset people that pay income taxes to some extent, but I think it's fair. But once you get into bundling, which you suggest on page 33, I worry that you got all the people on the eastern side of the state who have to compete with New Hampshire on sales taxes. You got people on the western side of the state, if you now increase to using legal fees and other services, who can just drive to New York State where they won't pay that sales tax and do their business there. If you tax soda, that's always been a tough one here in this building. The Retail Association comes in with all their examples of what should be taxed and what shouldn't. And if you tax in sugar, there's none in my Diet Coke. Anyway, I think my point is the bundling may sound like good, but it could blow up and destroy the effort to try to move forward with what is an important issue. Any thoughts on? And I don't know what it meant by, in order to do it, the increase would have to be larger than any state.
Right, and so what we try to do is to say, look at other states, for example. What is the maximum sales tax, or what's the maximum kind of use tax that people have? You probably don't want, it's up to you, but like going over those may not be something that Vermont wants to do because it hasn't been done before. You don't know how people are going to react. Like you said, there's a lot of considerations. And so it becomes clear that when you have these larger gaps, these one sources of funding are not going to be at a level commensurate with what's seen currently in the United States. So what we try to do is say, okay, if you want to have the more generous subsidy schedules and you want to take on that larger gap, how can you potentially cover that? Which is why we say, well, you don't want to increase one tax to a rate that's not quite seen right now. What you can do is increase that a smaller amount and then make up the rest with these soda taxes or these hospitality taxes. Now, every tax has its pros and its cons, right? And the Vermont contact, maybe just con, but the Vermont context, right? And so our effort wasn't necessarily to say this is the right answer and this is the best answer. What we try to do is say here are a variety of options to get a flavor of what would it take in order to do these different types of gaps. And now you, with your knowledge of what the context is, can say this makes sense, this doesn't make sense for whatever reason. We're going to go this opposite direction, but what we try to do is give you a foundation off which you can work, and not necessarily say this is the one that you should pick.
So when you were looking at other states and comparing, were you stacking the taxes they have? And so that you were saying comparing, well, we already have the rooms and meals tax, other states do. We already have the sales tax. We already have a very progressive income tax. We have a relatively high property tax. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking at that cumulative tax burden as opposed to sales taxes, 6%, a lot of states might be 9%. Are you looking at the individual taxes? Or are you looking at that taxing in aggregate as it relates to the individual taxpayer?
So what we try to do is to say what individual level taxes that are currently in the United States, what are ways that in aggregate would get the gap, right? And so there has to be an aggregate tax burden when you bundle these different taxes, but our goal is to try to make sure that each of those components is at least within the bounds that are seen currently. And then I'll let Aaron speak to this, but when we modeled that aggregate burden, even in those bundles and in the larger gaps, we saw that the total economic welfare to the individual household is going to, the effect would be pretty small, meaning that their total economic welfare would stay about the same, a little bit less obviously, but not that much differently. And then Aaron, if you want to maybe provide more insight on that.
Yeah, I'll just provide a little bit more context. So what I think is a good starting point is slide 31, which goes through and gives some sort of base case scenarios. And so what we were trying to do with slide 31 was to say, given the landscape of what Vermont looks like, if we incrementally increase some of the taxes that you already have, or if we were to add different taxes, what are sort of the orders of magnitude that we would likely see from those changes in the tax structure? And when we looked at those incremental decisions across different things, what we saw was that no one instrument could likely get us to that $260 million. The other piece to keep in mind is that we're not just talking about taxes. That's where we had come in. And because we don't want to we don't have a best option, that there's also this idea of reallocation across the budget. And so are there ways that we can take money from other places and provide it for early childhood education because of this idea that taxes may not be the most popular thing in all of government? And so these are these sort of base cases or baseline cases are meant to give you an idea that increasing your hospitality tax your meals and rooms tax is already relatively high compared to the rest of the United States. If we go up another percentage, what would that likely do? It'd likely raise a small amount of money. we think about applying the Philadelphia soda tax in the Vermont contest, it would raise about $24 million. So it's a small amount of money. When we start to think about, let's expand the sales tax to something akin to a service tax, what does that do? That gets us, $100 million. And so how can we incrementally change around the Vermont tax system? And what would that do in terms of funding availability? But knowing that the trade-offs are what you have to make, they're not what we have to make. And only you can make those trade-offs and not us.
Yeah, I think that's weighing on us. I think Senator Starr and then Senator from Hinsdale.
Well, I'm wondering what the object of what we're doing and what we're trying to solve. And I mean, I know that preschool or childcare people, they want to raise. But how many people work in that particular field at the present? And it shows in the report that we would possibly gain 6,000 more workers.
No, 600.
600.
2,800.
That is the number, that's the total number of people available. Not all of them would choose to work. So when we estimate who would actually start working, it's around 6,000 to 2,800.
So why not pay whoever those people are that are staying home and taking care of their kids? If you paid them, a stipend of a certain amount, let them take care of their own children. Early on, we were taught that children that stay with their parents and are raised by their parents do good and sometimes better than the ones that go to a paid daycare place. If we got them going to school already at the 4 years old, they're going to preschool. So that means there's only those that are, the mother should be with them or somebody should be with them until they're at least 6 months.
I don't think you're asking a question, are you, Senator?
Well, I'm trying to get some numbers to see if the difference between taking care of the children between 6 months old and 4 years old is worth the amount of money we're talking about trying to raise to pay it, or would it be cheaper to pay the family member to stay home and raise their own children?
You're talking about paying them a full salary with benefits?
No, you give them a stipend. I mean, my wife stayed home when my son was growing up until he got to kindergarten, and my son's wife stayed home until our grandchildren got to be in a kindergarten. And golly, they turned out pretty good.
Well, I'm gonna, unless there's a specific, I guess what you're saying is you're weighing the cost, if we were to support parents to remain at home versus what the cost is to provide the childcare. But that's an interesting, and maybe it's a discussion that committees are going to have here in this room as a result of the study. The other question, I think you had a question, Senator
I did, and I don't outright disagree with Senator Starr's ways that my grandmother. I mean, I think it's sad that we lose some of that ability. I didn't go to school till first grade, so I didn't go to school till first grade. So I hear what you're saying.
My son didn't go until he was 7.5.
Wait,
Yes, I'll get to the question. So on slide, I'm on slide 22, and I just want to really make sure I understand this slide.
What page is
it? It's slide 22. I don't know.
I can bring it up. Yeah, this is.
It is page 22 as well.
Oh, no, that's.
I'm in the big report.
Oh,
No, this is a
Slide
slide.
22.
I'll find it.
It's a little bit different than the big one. It's actually a little more complicated.
This
So
is the 5 alternatives.
that's the one.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So it's overwhelming to look at, and I see I may have missed this, but there's like, the blue family has 2 kids, the green family has 1 child or 2.
No, that was a different
Parents.
slide. So this is all for a family of 3.
Okay, so when you say a family
Well,
of 3.
except 4 and 5 because it's a different.
Okay,
Yeah.
so when you say a family of 3, you mean 2 parents and 1 child. So you mean sending 1 child?
So the subsidy structure is agnostic to what that family structure is. So it could
Okay.
be 1 parent, 2 children, it could be 2 parents, 1 child.
Okay, so
The
this
difference.
is just assuming the poverty level of a 3-person household.
Exactly.
But it's not supposing how many kids are. in
That's right. And the
system.
subsidy schedules
Is-
do not take into account, currently do not take into account the size of the.
It's just
the
a family
Right.
subsidy, not an
Family
individual.
Right.
Exactly.
It's, okay, so then it's still, the subsidy schedule on all of these doesn't at all take into account how many kids you have. It's your own income, and once you have kids, you would be paying in to send kids, but not.
So this
Right.
takes into account your family in that these are expressed as a percentage of poverty, right?
Okay.
And so
Yes.
it's the ratio of your income
Right.
to what that threshold is. And that threshold is dependent on the family size, right? So a family of 3 has a different threshold than a family of 4 or 5.
I'm just trying to, so I'm just trying to be this family.
Yeah.
You have 1 child
Yep.
and you enroll them. And once you enroll your first child, you start paying into the childcare system based on your income. Any subsequent child you have, you don't change your payment into the system.
You pay up to whatever the subsidy schedule is. So let's say it's 10% of the income, right? So if your first child takes 7% of your income, when you put in your second child, you'll pay 3% more to get to that cap. If your first child is 10% of your income.
Federal poverty level for a family of 3 versus 4.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah. So, but the point being is that.
But that takes, I mean, that's what I'm curious about. I'm having a hard time taking that into account because your family size changes. And then your number of kids in school change, the number of kids doesn't impact it, but your family size has changed. So then you might hit a higher income threshold
If you have another.
before you get a subsidy.
I think Lynn has an answer.
Yeah, I think Lynn, do you have a better way to say this?
Yeah, let me just try to clarify. So the current subsidy system under CCFAP is a family-based contribution. So you pay the same amount of, for example, at the 1.5 times poverty, it's $25 a week. And you pay that whether you have 1 child in subsidized care or 2 children, or very rare do we have families that have more than 2 children in that 0 to 5 age range. But again, adding additional children, the current system is the contribution is based at the family level. Adding additional children does not increase the family contribution. The family contribution, though, does vary by where your family income is and family size relative to the poverty threshold for that family size. Everybody of a family of size 3 would, at 1.5 times poverty, would pay that $25 a week, whether they have 1 or 2 children in care. And then you're paying more for a family of size 3, holding that constant, as your family goes up into the next increment of income relative to poverty. So I hope that's clear. We had assumed the same approach. I will note that the states are about evenly divided between those that the family contribution increases with an additional child, each additional child being subsidized, and those that do it on a family basis. And Vermont is one of the states that the family contribution is fixed for a family, regardless of the number of children receiving subsidies.
Okay, so even if your child goes to K through 12, you're still, even if your child goes to K through 12 and you have 2 kids, you're paying in because you have a child 0 to 5.
It's also no matter what their age is.
Yes, if you have 1, so let's say you have 2 children, one of them is preschool age and the other is school age. We're just looking at the cost of care for that child who's not yet in school. and your contribution would be based on having that one child in a setting, and depending upon your income and family size and so on, you would be making a contribution. Separately, if you were to take up also the school age care part of the system, you could figure out how to integrate that into the existing subsidy schedule. We do happy to talk more about that. But yes, you would be paying that. So this is one of the reasons why in that chart where you saw a family of size 3, they were paying at any given income level a larger percentage of family income than a family of size 6. And that's because of the fact that for the same ratio of income to poverty, a larger family means a larger family income. But they're all paying $25 a week or $50 a week or $75, wherever they are on the schedule.
We'll be having more
Okay,
detailed
yeah.
conversation as obviously there's a lot of complexity and if your income doesn't change and your family size does increase, then you have a different federal poverty level.
Yeah, your income rate should always go down. If your family increases, right, it's more generous for larger families.
Right.
So if your income stays the same, but your family increases, you're effectively going down. So you'll never pay more, right? Because you'll actually be, as far as the federal poverty guidelines, lower on that scale.
So what I think I'm struggling with looking at this is that you can't fully compare schedules 1 through 3 to schedules 4 and 5.
Yeah, because what schedules 4 and 5 do is that it's just going to be a percentage of your income.
Right.
That's it. As opposed to 1 through 3, which say you pay $25 if you fall in this bucket versus $50 if you fall in this other bucket. So one's a percentage of income, one versus one's a flat fee based on where you are. So the current system is that flat fee.
Okay.
And but we gave you options, like Lynn said, there's some states that are going, instead of this flat fee, it's just a percentage of your income.
But on the next page, you put the alternative 2 in yellow. Was that?
That's because that's what we, in this slide, cost out. Like
You just used it as an example. It wasn't the one that you think is preferred because you can't really compare it to some of the other.
Right, so we gave you different options for you to consider. We used that one just as the kind of example scenario.
Yes, go ahead.
And if I could just add one other point. So they are comparable in the sense that you could take a family with a given configuration and income and ask what their contribution would be under each of those schedules. And so as we generate these numbers that you see here, we're essentially doing that. We're taking that schedule, which is a little bit more complex than what we plotted. The versions in the report show the fact that even within an income bracket, there's a little bit of change in as a percentage of income, but that's all taken into account in generating these estimates of what the expected family contribution would be based on these different subsidy schedules. So they're comparable in the sense that we could aggregate up the total family contribution and compare them. You could compare them in the context of looking at any given family, their income, size, ages of children, and so on, and determine what they would pay under these different schedules.
So you have one follow-up and then another question.
It sounded for a moment like someone was saying that we would be somewhat unique in not taking number of children into account at all in our system, that you are not either incentivized or disincentivized around the number of kids you have in the system if you're only paying by income regardless of how many kids you have. That is unique that would be unique in the country.
Not unique.
Okay.
Now, again, some states and the way they calculate the family contribution also do it on a per family basis. Others do it on a per child basis. And those numbers are cited in the report.
Yeah, that was a policy decision to go to a family amount. So that's something that, and other states have chosen that option, but that was one that I think in the last few years was changed here. Rich,
Well, I'm somewhat struggling with some of the same things inherited, but and you had different, you have different models of different types. When I look at the economic impact, and there's a number of places in here, table 3.5, and you've got on page 40, the estimated labor, and then on page 55. But you make the point that the economic impacts or workforce impacts are very modest with this. But where they're the greatest are especially among lower income and mothers and young children. So of your models, I'm, in not having spent a bunch of time, and I think this kind of gets it, if I was going to focus on what helped the most, both economically and knowing that the lower income mothers and young children are probably the most at risk people, I'm having trouble figuring out how the focus would be in the different models that you come up with. And I think that's kind of where you're coming from. How do I sort through this to figure that out?
Yeah, and I think part of what makes that difficult is that everything is expressed in like multiples of the poverty level, right? So you don't have this exact number of income or dollars to kind of easily benchmark.
And it's somewhat what Senator Starr is saying in not the most artful way, but what he's getting at. How do I see this to focus? And in particularly, I want to focus on what you write here, especially among lower income mothers and young children. How do I take this to focus?
Right, and so the question, and part of the reason why there's kind of these large tables in the report is that trying to think of, yeah, if you look at table 3.4, which you don't have to do it now, what we tried to say is what is going to be the amount that you have to pay in and what is going to be that gap that you have to fund as you kind of go up the income ladder. So as you start at 1.5 times poverty, how much, if you fund then, what is going to be the amount and what's going to be the gap that you have to pay? If you want to go up to 2.5 times poverty, how much would you have to pay? Where would you have to find that money? Up to 3.5, up to 4, and 4.5.
I get that. So
Yeah.
But you know, you ask for a contribution level. Would I be better off at the low income levels not to have any contribution?
And currently there is no contribution up to 1.5, right?
Yeah.
So you definitely want to start from the bottom of the income distribution up. The question about how far you want to go are those trade-offs versus of the benefit to people in the lower income scale versus what the state has to.
And lower, could you define more income above the 150 where,
Yeah.
because you're not paying anything under the 150.
Yeah, so
it's
for a
like
family of-
150 to 250 or?
So families, again, it depends on the size of the family, but if you're a family of 3, 150 is 34,545. 350, which is where the current subsidy system ends, right? So nobody in the current subsidy system above 3.5 times the poverty level gets anything. That is 80,000 for a family of 3. It's 113,000 for a family of 5. We cost out up to 500%, and that would take care of about 80% of children and in the pre-K world or the early childhood world. So that 500% threshold is 115,000 for a family of 3 and 162,000 for a family.
Yeah, this is, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
The poverty chart.
Exactly, right? So
That's-
that is, you kind of have to use that chart to guide, you know, who do we think are the neediest in our state based on our context? And exactly, and how much would it then use those charts to say, okay, if we fund up to 3.5 times poverty, how much is that going to cost us?
But clearly from this, the higher I go on the poverty chart, the higher
The
I
higher
get to
the benefit.
the benefit drops off.
Well, it depends on what you're measuring for the
Depends on-
outcomes.
Yeah. I mean, ECE expensive is, the ECE care is expensive.
Let me
So-
ask another question, which is sort of similar to what we've experienced in other areas, professional areas, and then we end up looking at extenders, like in healthcare. The more we add credentialing, and the more, and how that influences compensation. What we're I'm just wondering, in our effort to take the system and focus it on, totally on early education, the extent to which we're going to constrain supply, because we're really dealing with two things. One of which is we don't have the number of providers. The question then becomes in this workforce where their shortage is pervasive, whether the compensation here, and because schools are having trouble recruiting too, are we actually for infant care, so much infant care is really the personal care, the nurturing, et cetera. Are we, by saying the minimum requirements here are going to have a 2-year degree, are we in fact going to end up constraining or exacerbating our problem with supply? Because a number of families, in fact, will pull together and hire a nanny. And they oftentimes are very caring and loving and nurturing, but they may not be degreed. So I'm just wondering that interplay between the more we focus on the credentials, and which we've done in other healthcare, then you run into, well, how do we extend? What do we have for extender capacity? And so in schools, our paraeducators aren't required to have 2 years. So I'm just wondering, in terms of looking at the fact that we have inadequate supply today, the extent to which the interplay between the desired level of training here will impact the choices families have or maybe not have at all. So that's a question that I'll go to Senator Lyons.
Well, yeah, it's a question. I want to add into that question how that type of training affects quality of care and sort of the neurodevelopmental issues around the
brain development before 3.
all of that, you know, and saccadic eye movements and all those things that are critically important. So I think, I don't know, Lynn.
I'll start with Lynn. I'll start and then Lynn can.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a multifaceted question. So,
Yeah.
so I think one thing to realize is that the ECE sector has a tougher labor market, a higher shortage, right? And one of the reasons, particularly since COVID, and one of the reasons, more so than the K-12 system, which also has that problem. And one of those reasons might be because the compensation is so low. So increasing the compensation might be one way that you have more stability and you bring more people towards that sector. People who otherwise wouldn't want to work in ECE sectors may want to start working in that sector, given that they have a more comparable wage. I think the second point to make is that this is probably not something you can do in 1 year, right? This is probably something you want to phase it in over a couple of years so that you, from a fiscal perspective, that's probably more feasible, but also you can start building kind of the infrastructure that you need in order to support that expanded ECE. So finding more places, educating more people. You might want to institute some credentialing programs in colleges to make sure that they can go get that education they need in order to become an ECE provider. And then the third thing I would say is that credentialing is one aspect, but what we're trying here is to model high quality care. So, and that high quality care is more than just having a nurturing adult in the room. It gets to more what Senator Lyons would say is nurturing child development. So one of the reasons why you want to have somebody with degrees is that they learn the science behind child development, so that they then learn what interactions help support that development of the child before 3 or before 5. So it's about providing a higher level of care than just having an adult, even a nurturing adult in the room. And then Lynn, I'll let you add to that.
Yeah, just a couple of additional points. Indeed, one of the issues facing the field is low compensation, which was an issue even before the pandemic, but it has meant during the pandemic and now coming out of the pandemic economy is that there's very little incentives for people to come back to the field or stay in the field when wages are starting to rise. In other sectors, that are paying not consistent with the higher education levels that we're expecting for this field with lower stress and better benefits. So we just finished a study in Hawaii where, in talking to early educators, they would say, I can go get the same pay working at Target. And it's less stress. And until you're going to recognize the skills and competencies that I bring then it's not worth it for me to stay in the field. The other issue with low compensation is it's not worthwhile investing in your own education. Most of us invested in education expecting that with that education, we would get more return in the labor market, which would pay back that initial investment of education. So in the early childhood field, one of the things we see is the difference between somebody, a lead teacher with an associate's degree and a bachelor's degree, is maybe a few $1,000s a year. There's almost no gap because the field is constrained in how much it's able to pay the workforce. And so once you build in the kind of salary schedule that we posit in the report, that starts to look like a reward for investing in that 2-year degree, that 4-year degree. And then lastly, I would point to a number of states that have gone through this process of upgrading the workforce, getting them the credentials that are needed, and then the associated compensation. And it is a process. It takes time to do it, but it's not a decades-long process. It can be done over several years of intensive effort of identifying who needs the additional education, supporting them with access to a higher education system that can support the degree attainment. So just a couple of additional thoughts that this is not impossible to undertake when you have the right investment in the field in the form of compensation.
A related question. I'm trying to unpack the $645 million estimate because I think I heard you say during your presentation you didn't regionally adjust some of the income estimates, which is fine because Vermont varies, as my friends outside of Chittenden County often remind me, a lot across different areas of the state. Could you give me an idea what that $645 million, what we're currently spending? So how much of an increase is that? And also within that $645 million estimate, where do you think we could unpack and understand more where there might be cost savings while still achieving high quality care, using public infrastructure, expanding some of our school infrastructure, or aligning that with some of our 0 through 5 offerings to better understand that $645 million and where there might be some levers to lower that?
So when we talk about not disaggregating by rural versus urban or regional, that's not to say that those differences are not baked in. It's just that we can't kind of parse that out and give you a reliable number that says for this region it's going to be this much and for that region it's going to be that much. So for example, if we take the wages that we're talking about, right? We're basing our models on the median or the average wage that we would expect a teacher to make. But that average, within that average, there's people who make less because maybe a rural county has a lower cost of living. And there's going to be people that have more because a city has a higher cost of living, but on average it collapses down to that one number that we use, right? So underlying a lot of these averages are that variation in the regions. It's just that we can't kind of pull out these numbers by those regions because the data is just, there's less people in rural areas, so it makes the data sparser, which makes our estimates a little bit harder to disseminate. So the $645 million is well, everything, right? And then what we did in the report was take out the $125 million that's currently in the system from federal and state funds. And then based on this, the different salaries or income contribution schedules, we took out how much families would pay. And so that gap is what's left. It is hard to say if you can kind of trim that number. So if, for example, you want to, something that Lynn said earlier is that you can make contracts with people based on for the provider based on their circumstance, right? So for example, if you want to contract with somebody in a school-based setting and you want to have them pay based on their costs for providing that high quality care, that might look different if they don't have to pay for the building versus somebody else, right? So I think that starts getting into the mechanisms that you all have to consider in order to try to extract as many cost savings as possible. But that wasn't, those types of contracts we didn't model out because those are policy decisions. Lynn, did you want to add anything to that?
Just a couple of other things. One is that after labor, the second largest source of costs in childcare and early learning settings is the cost of the space that's used. So if there are ways to subsidize more of the space that providers are using, so examples would be, and I don't know the context in Vermont, if Vermont has excess public buildings that aren't being used that could be made available to childcare providers at no cost or subsidized cost of space, that would help to reduce some of that per child costs associated with care provision. Likewise, when you have space in public schools, which tend to have already paid for, depreciated their buildings, that can be another use of space that would have some reduction in cost. Another factor that's gaining traction in the field, especially among smaller providers, so this would be true in family childcare homes, and we noted that Vermont tends to have relatively small providers, is the use of what's called a shared services model. So rather than each provider having to go out and purchase goods and services on their own, when they can pool together, everything from buying diapers and paper towels to also sharing in the costs of the financial administration of their program, whether that's payroll or accounting, getting insurance purchased, accessing group-based benefits like healthcare. Those are all ways in which you can take these businesses that are really small businesses and try to make them a little bit more efficient. And that would have an effect on lowering that estimate of $645 million that we provided.
Go ahead.
I just had a question about other states. Other states have been mentioned in different contexts. Has there been like a meta study of all what's happening on subsidizing childcare, public right childcare in other states? You guys did a report in somewhere in Hawaii than this one, right? But I didn't know if anybody's looked at like other efforts, maybe not as grand as this, but.
Well, so the National Academy of Sciences, which Lynn serves on, put out a big report on costing out childcare, and took a similar approach where they said, what is going to be high quality childcare and how much is it? How can we go about providing that? Lynn, do you know of any like meta studies across states, or I don't know of anybody that does it.
Like looked at all the different models. I mean, I think a lot of states just don't subsidize it at all, but at least that's my assumption, that there's a smaller group, less that actually have robust programs. But those that do have robust programs that have either tried to build a workforce or just provide better high quality childcare, what they've done and how they've paid for it.
Yeah.
There is a great deal of attention to different states and their models. All states provide subsidized childcare because it's federal monies that then need to be matched with state funds. So I'm not aware of any states that turn away the federal funds. Likewise, all states have Head Start and Early Head Start. All but I think now 7 states also fund a state pre-K program. They vary in the extent to whether they're more targeted. Vermont is on the universal end, so that's more unusual than the more targeted programs. And I would say even at this stage, many cities are now involved in expanding the early care and education options and the subsidies, because cities have recognized that regardless of what their state's doing, they need to be making it possible for families to have access to affordable and high quality care. So we have a lot of different examples and models. There's good data on kind of the policies that states have adopted. So I mentioned whether states, have a flat family contribution or it varies with the number of children. We can easily tell you what that, those policy choices are across states, how far up the price, the distribution of prices, regional market rates, states fund, what percentage of income relative to poverty is the upper limit on subsidies. So we can look at that, putting it all together in some of the ways that you might want to be able to capture. I'm not aware of a systematic effort to do that across all the states, but there's certainly state by state examples, and we'd be happy to point you to some of the model states, if you will, the ones that are really pushing forward in this area. Although not a state, I think one of the jurisdictions that's really pushing the envelope would be Washington, D.C., where they are putting in place a comprehensive compensation schedule of cash and benefits across the birth to 5 continuum. They have essentially universal subsidies as well. So they're the jurisdiction that in many ways is looked to now as sort of pushing the envelope the furthest. But there are other examples, if not states, then, cities like New York City or San Antonio and Denver and Seattle and, long list, San Francisco of these cities that have been also pushing out the extent to which that they have these subsidies in place and promoting high quality and a well-compensated workforce at the same time.
One thing that we haven't really talked about, and we've heard a lot from, and that's Vermont employers are saying that the lack of childcare is a very serious concern. And I'm just wondering, in looking at this, and it probably is difficult to do, but if in fact having a good robust childcare system has a beneficial impact in keeping that parent in the workforce, there's obviously hiring, retention, training, and that revolving door adds a lot of costs on the employer side. Is there any way that you can quantify? In other words, so much of what we're experiencing now is not only the cost of the care and the lack of access. I mean, people are arranging slots before they even,
And paying for it.
and paying for it before they have the children. But employers are saying, we need to keep that parent in the workforce, and we have an investment in training. So is there, in your analysis, any way of attributing what are those benefits that might be experienced by having more people in the workforce, by keeping the ones who are in the workforce, and avoided costs of recruitment and training?
I mean, it's hard to kind of quantify that on a large scale like Vermont, but there are a number of dimensions where that could happen, right? So a person who's already working may choose to work more hours, so they might go part-time, they might go to full-time if they have stable childcare or longer childcare that's subsidized. A worker who works full-time may have less interruptions, right? So if they have stable childcare, they don't have to leave work or try to work from home or try to make arrangements around the childcare. They can do more towards work in that respect. And then there's also like hard to quantify things like, are they less stressed out? Are they, which in that stress could affect the children, right? Because that's a family unit that's more stable and more secure, might be able to function both better at work and at home. I think a lot of that is just really hard to quantify, particularly across the state. So it is important to recognize that some of those benefits may not be reflected in the report. And so the employers may enjoy those benefits as well, more stable workforce, and maybe, people who can worry less about at home if their children are well taken care of. Erin and Lynn, I don't know if you want to add anything like that.
Yeah, I think just to reinforce the point that those kind of benefits to employers are probably more anecdotally documented and more qualitatively documented than having firm, quantitative estimates of, how many millions of dollars, in savings there might be. But I think, that's in part why employers have really gotten engaged around this issue. And I'd say they're thinking about their current workforce. And as the economy expands, those additional workers can make a difference. So even though, we've talked about a little bit about the trade-offs between supporting parents with young children so they can work versus having them at home, employers see that as an important potential expansion of the workforce. And that's where you get the growth in your state economy. So employers are paying attention to their current workforce, but they're also recognizing that these are investments in their future workforce. And so that, I think, has as long as I've been working in this field for 25 years or so, I've really seen the expansion of the investment on the part of the business community in this area and recognizing the importance of it. And it just takes something like the pandemic to realize how critical this workforce is and, what the loss of that capacity could do.
Thank you. Senator Starr and then.
Yeah, I'm wondering, did you take into account, the district that I represent is very rural. So parents usually leave at 6:15 to go to work for 7 in Newport or Derby. So the daycare would have to be, private ones will, certain ones will open up early. And then they stay until 4:30 or 5 because when parents get out, is that all figured into your costs? Start early and late type?
So they are, and so what we try to do is model, we modeled how much more demand there would be for these services, given these expanded subsidies, and then included that in our cost estimates. And rural districts have higher child costs for a lot of reasons, right? Like there's that reason, there's also the fact that you have to still pay for the building even though you have less children in the building. And so those regional costs are embedded in our cost structure. Go ahead.
See, our schoolhouses, we're down 30,000, 40,000 kids statewide in our schools. I mean, most of our schools have ample room to do a system like this, but if you run a public system to get public employees to come into work at 6 o'clock or 6:30, you're gonna have problems. Whereas a private system, the owner's the one that's getting up and.
I think Lynn has a comment. Did I hear you, Lynn? Did you have a comment?
Yeah, so let me just add that. So we, in modeling the cost at a center family child care home, we assume that their hours of operation are 10 hours a day. So that would allow for the early drop off and the extended day, recognizing that many parents need that longer day. We don't assume that all parents will need that longer day, but it allows the provider, assumes the provider has the resources to be open that many hours, which also means we aren't assuming that the same staff person is necessarily there all 10 hours a day. So the cost structure assumes a certain staffing model of staff who are there for 8 hours a day, with some coming in later in the day for the extended care, some start on an earlier schedule and finish earlier, so that you're building this model of staffing that covers those 10 hours with the required ratios, allowing for staff to have time like planning time or professional development time. So it's a pretty, sort of complex way of thinking about how you'd staff an operation like that, recognizing exactly that issue of the need for somewhat variable hours and extended hours on the part of many parents.
And I'm looking at the clock, and I have at least 2 people who have indicated their questions. So, Keisha, do you want to, and then us go to Tom.
I'm looking at page 36 of the report, and my question is just if JFO, between what you've given here and what they have from your assumptions, gives us a potential roadmap to look at, say, the cost of 0 to 6 months olds and what the relative trade-off is if we do instead pay people to stay at home. So essentially, is there a way to look at what you've done for 0 to 11-month-olds and create a cost estimate that can then be instead mentally transferred to paid family leave?
Lynn, that's a tough question.
Of course you can.
Simple. I don't know if the calculations are in here, like per month of care for it.
It's a variation of centers.
Yeah, it is.
That
I'm trying to think.
Are there circumstances under which that it is that having the parent, particularly with newborns, have that time, as opposed to the cost of putting the infant into an early education program. And I'm sure it can be costed out. Yeah. And then of course you don't have the overhead, you don't have travel, and you don't have a whole lot of things. So it's something that's been out there as an option. But
yeah, my guess is that there's better modeling options than using this as the basis, as opposed to just directly modeling that policy.
Okay,
but that is obviously something that can be a topic of further conversation.
right.
So Senator Chittenden from Chittenden.
I just want to connect Senator Starr's question with the previous point I think you all made, which is that there is an increased capacity of school space because of the declining school age population. And I personally am one that want to see more school infrastructure, more modern school infrastructure. And I just think I heard you say earlier in the response to my question that your model with the $645 million estimate does not factor in or include the less cost it would be if a lot of this childcare was provided inside of public school infrastructure. If we expanded some of our elementary schools to look at the 0 through 5, centrally located, distributed throughout our community, that $645 million likely, based on your modeling, would be less if we were to leverage and integrate into our public school infrastructure more of this childcare service.
I think that's correct.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just to clarify too, that would be on an annual operating basis.
Well, how about that? Wait a minute, Lynn had a comment.
I just wanted to say that on an annual operating basis, yes, that would lower the cost. I think there would be costs to make that transformation of existing school space into appropriate space for younger children. So for those of you who've been in a childcare facility know that it's not just smaller sized furniture, but also changing the way bathrooms are built out and how space is used that's different even from what an elementary classroom might look like. So there's kind of retrofitting, those kinds of costs that would be one time to build out that space.
Not to mention that you'd move into a unionized environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
So Senator Sears, you're going to have the last question because we're the last word.
It's more of a comment. If our goal, what is our goal here? You make comments. I can make one. Our goal here is to get a more comfortable workforce. That's what I've heard from my employers. We want better outcomes for kids. And I'm not going to argue whether staying at home or being away is better. But if you're staying at home, you're probably not in the workforce. And one of the goals here is to improve our workforce. And some of the companies I'm hearing from are fairly high wage companies that are having a hard time finding workers. One's our local hospital, another one's, what do you call it? It's got computers all over the place.
A
Tech company, thank you. So I'm just, want to keep that in mind here. One of the goals is to get a better workforce, more stable workforce that's, comfortable. So I think we have competing.
We do have, I just went to a Lamoille North, so every elementary school in my supervisory unit is short of teachers. Hyde Park Elementary is 5 teachers down. Part of the question I've got is if we turn this around and we're able to pay workers in childcare more, how long before we think we could get to a place where we open up placements? COVID has dropped the number of placements, and I'm not hopeful we have the labor force to turn that around quickly. So what's the,
I guess you want to get it in the last one because if we're getting to 4.
Sorry,
I made a comment.
No, but it's right in the same line as you are.
I think the one thing that we have to realize is that this is really a very complicated endeavor here in terms of really clear what is it we want for outcomes. There are myriad policy decisions as you outlined, depending on income levels and so forth. And so this is the beginning of a very long discussion, I guess is what I'm saying. So I just am looking at the clock and it's 4:30. And do you have one? I said Senator Sears was the last one in, but if you're going to have heartburn, Senator Westman, with your question, I'll entertain it and then we're going to call it a day.
Well, Did you look at the labor piece?
I would say.
We dropped it in labor. Have you looked at?
In other words, is the workforce shortage acuity that much greater in this particular area than in other areas of workforce that we're?
I mean, it is, it's like Lynn said, it is in part because of the low compensation, right? But what something else that Lynn said, and I'll say two things, is one that it's gonna have to be, you build this up over time. The time horizon, like Lynn said, it's not 10 years, but it's, yeah, it's a shorter time horizon than like a 10 years, but it can be done. It's gonna be an intense process, but if you do it and deliberatively, intensely, it can be done within a shorter time horizon. And the other point I'd say about the employer piece is that this can also be seen as an investment in the future of Vermont's workforce, and that there's a lot of evidence that high quality early childhood educations have positive outcomes, more employment, less less special education planning. A lot of these long-term outcomes for kids who then become that next generation of employers. It's a little bit down the line, but there's the immediate benefit employers might see based on what we talked about, but also that longer term for the next generation of employers.
Sure. Okay. Well, we thank you very much for being here in person, and for those of you who are joining us remotely, we appreciate your being available to us as we're having our first discussions here. And again, thank you. And it's 4:30, and at this point, I'm going to adjourn the